The last time around, we started with chapter 7, which was transport in flowering plants. We talked about the structure of the stem. It has the epidermis and the vascular bundles with the xylem and the phloem. So we went into details of those. Xylem in particular. Then we talked about the cortex. We shifted towards the roots and then the root hairs and the uptake of water from the root hairs and the movement of water through the root hair towards the xylem and then up to the stem and the leaves. And then we mentioned transpiration, which is the loss of water vapor from leaves. So you've got water coming in from the xylem to the mesophyll cells via osmosis. From the spongy mesophyll cells, water evaporates from the surface, and there's water vapor in the air spaces. And from there, the water vapor diffuses, not osmosis, but diffuses out through the stomata into the atmosphere, right? And so the water transpiring from leaves creates a pull or a suction, right, causing water to travel up the xylem, and this flow of water is called the transpiration stream. Continuing from here, there are a number of experiments given in the text to demonstrate transpiration. What we'll be moving towards now is the rate of transpiration. I don't know why this keeps resetting. That's good enough. Okay. Rate of transpiration. Right, so transpiration, as we just saw and reviewed, recalled, is the evaporation of water vapor from the leaves, right? Is the removal of water vapor from the leaves into the air surrounding the leaves. So anything that's going to affect evaporation or the amount of air surrounding the leaves is going to affect transpiration. So the first thing is humidity, right? And humidity is the amount of water vapor in the air, right? And so it goes to say that when there's high humidity, the rate of transpiration will be low. And the reason for that is because the air is already saturated, so to speak, with water vapor. Or in terms of diffusion, there isn't so much of a diffusion gradient, right? The concentration of water vapor in the air is either higher or equal to, or even if it's lower, it's not as much, right? You could, if you want to, put numbers to it, for example, maybe in the air, the saturation level is, let's say, 57, and inside the leaf, either it is equal, so it's not going to promote it, it's either lower, right, but not so much, maybe it's 47, so not much, not a lot of difference, right? So in either of those two cases, the rate of transpiration will be lower, right? So these figures don't really mean anything, it's just to explain, right? And so when there's already a lot of water vapor in the air surrounding the leaves, it will not promote any more coming from the leaves, right? So that's going to, and obviously If the humidity is low, it goes right. You can flip that around. In fact, it should have says low. And so you will have a comparatively increased rate of transpiration. And for the opposite reasons, because there isn't as much water vapor in the air, and so the one evaporating from the leaf is easily accepted, right? So there is a diffusion gradient. Second up, we have air movements. And so what is air going to do? It is going to blow the water vapor. It's going to blow away the water vapor surrounding the leaf, right? That is if there is wind blowing, right? And so if there's any water vapor surrounding the leaf and there are air movements, there is wind blowing, and so all of that water will be removed, and so that will maintain a diffusion gradient. And so that would cause an increase in the rate of transpiration. Keep in mind that what we're talking about is water being lost from the leaf, right? So if it's very windy, what that would promote is continuous transpiration and a lot of it, right? So con- continuously increased, continuously increased rates of transpiration. And as I believe I mentioned earlier, if not, right, transpiration occurs through the stomata and the uptake of carbon dioxide also occurs through the stomata, right? And so it is the same passage for both, and there needs to be a balance. So if there's continuous high rates, increased rates of transpiration and water is being lost in large quantities, then that's actually going to cause a problem for the plant, right? Because you don't necessarily have enough water in the soil to keep coming and to allow water to be lost to the environment again, right? And so in this case, a safety measure by the plant is that the stomata close. Either they close partially or entirely, depending on the right condition. And this is a compromise. Do you want to avoid losing water, because that's also necessary for the plant and its shape and everything? And obviously water is used in photosynthesis, but right, you're going to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide that you can take in, which is also required for photosynthesis. So in either case, photosynthesis is being affected, right? And the plant's health and all of that. If the wind is not blowing, if there is little or no air movement, right, then the rate of transpiration will be low. Can you tell me why that is? Yes, Hara?
Can you repeat that again?
If there is little or no air movement, then the rate of transpiration will be low. It will be decreased. Can you tell me why that is?
Because of humidity?
Well, not because of humidity in the sense that, the saturation of water vapor in the air itself, but because, right, water vapor will be concentrating around the leaf. So you could say that the air around the leaves will become humid, if you want to use that term. Right? They will concentrate in the air outside surrounding the leaves. And so obviously that will affect the diffusion gradient. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Then you have temperature. And this one I believe is pretty simple. The higher the atmospheric temperature, right, the higher the rate of transpiration, because it's going to be hot, and so you're going to have increased evaporation of water. Right, so a purpose that transpiration serves is to cool the leaf down and cool the plant down. Right, that's one of the purposes of transpiration. And so if it's hot, there will be more evaporation, more water loss, and to keep the plant cool. Again, right, if it's too hot, it will cause wilting because too much water vapor will be lost, and right, so the plant will start to droop. And you may have seen that with plants during the summer, especially, right, during midday when it's really hot, right, and they're all, drooping and low, just slouching and stuff like that. And when the temperature is low, obviously the rate of transpiration will be lower because not as much evaporation will be promoted by the temperature. And obviously we're talking about in case of atmospheric temperatures, it's not like, if it gets really, really low, then trees generally lose their leaves in those areas of the world, right? And so the situation really changes. Transpiration is not what we'll be discussing in that scenario. So low temperatures, right? Low rate of transpiration. Simple. So how is water lost from the leaf anyway?
So, like, is transpiration good for plants or not?
It is. It is. Right. For one thing, it is because of transpiration that leaves are able, that the plant is able to take in water from the roots and transport it all the way up, depending on how large the plant or the tree is, how tall it is, transport it to all other tissue, all other cells. Right? It's not just the leaves that require water, right? So, and secondly, transpiration helps to keep the plant cool because you can imagine, like, if it's 42 degrees or even higher during the summer, and you're just standing in one single position facing the sun directly, even as a human being, even though you have homeostasis, which we'll talk about later, uh, right? you're going to start feeling very hot. And so you can sort of imagine that the temperature of the leaves gets really high because they're constantly facing the sun in the summer, right? And so the loss of water helps to cool them down, and that's very important because life can be sustained within a certain temperature range. So if it gets really hot, the cells will die, and we see them. We see that happening in the summer as well, right? If it's really hot, plants die, or at least some of the leaves die, if not the entire plant, right? And that's simply because either of water loss, too much water loss, or simply because of the heat, right? So transpiration is, I mean, you could say in a way that because it is a natural process, it's good, right? Whether or not we are able to understand natural processes and pass judgment on them, uh, I would say, I mean, from our perspectives, which are very limited, we would say something is good or bad. But if it's happening in nature without any external interference, if it's something that happens on its own, then that's fine, right? That there's probably some benefit to it that we may or may not understand. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So if you recall, when we talked about osmosis, right, the vacuole is filled, the cell sap in the vacuole, right, there's a lot of water in it. So you have the cell vacuole that has the cell sap, which is a lot of water and other stuff. And when it's full of water, it applies a turgor pressure on the cell wall. So there's an outward turgor pressure on cell wall. You have a question. I will come back to your question later. All right, so there's an outward turgor pressure, and what this does is it forces some of the water out of the cell wall. Right, and so what happens then, that water evaporates into the air spaces between the cells, and those are between the spongy mesophyll cells. Right, so it's in the air spaces between the cells, and then from there out the stomata. So whatever water is lost is replenished by water being taken up, by the roots. And so there needs to be a balance, right? Or at least is, or perhaps hopefully a surplus of water available uh, as compared to what is being lost. Next, right? How does water move through the xylem? So the water movement in the xylem. Let's see. So what happens is, right, if you in any other way you try to suck water up, you cannot do it for higher than 10 meters. But trees that are very tall, right, they have continuous columns of water flowing through the xylem, uh, right, and there is no break, right, so you don't normally find, so the water is in continuous streams or columns, right, there are no breaks generally or air bubbles, right. And why that happens is, uh, first of all, the xylem vessel is very like long, it's vertical and it's thin, are long, vertical and thin. So that helps, right? That's one thing. And water has this property of cohesion, cohesion and adhesion, right? So the water molecules have cohesion. What does that mean? Cohesion means that they stick to each other. And this way they sort of pull each other up. Right? They also have the property of adhesion, right? Which means that the water molecules stick to the walls of the xylem. Right? So because of these properties, you can have these continuous streams, these continuous columns of water traveling through the xylem at great heights. Right? Is that clear?
Yeah.
So they mentioned that an experiment was performed where they took a stem and they placed it in a die, and then they cut the outer section to study it, and right, how they removed the outer section, and that did not affect the movement of water until you know uh, and even if you kill it, it doesn't stop the water from flowing. And so that is evidence for the non-living nature of the xylem vessel. So it's like a small part. You can read it. If it still doesn't make sense, you can ask me later. Then there's the issue of wilting that we've already covered, right? So wilting is when there's not enough water in the cell. So there's water loss due to transpiration, too much transpiration, right? And you could say there is excessive water loss from the plant cells, right? Turgor is lost, right, due to fall in pressure, what we just talked about, and what we've talked about in earlier chapter as well. So the plant cells try to maintain their state of being turgid, but it can only last so long, and so there comes a point where the cells become flaccid. And so, right, the plant will become limp and it will droop.
Can you please explain that again?
Well, we've mentioned that osmosis and turgor is important in providing mechanical support to the plant, right? Especially plants that don't
Mm.
have strong barks, right? So they're just green stem plants, for example. So how do they keep standing up straight? They keep standing up straight because of the plant cells always being turgid, right? But if there is a lot of wind blowing, especially when it's hot, right? And there's low humidity, and put in all those factors, and a lot of water has been lost due to transpiration. So, right, the plant is not able to recover water as quickly, and so water is lost from the cells. That's where it's coming from, right? And so if it goes on for longer than the plant is able to cope, then enough water leaves the cell that the turgor is lost. So it's no longer, all swelled up and stiff and all that, right? It's no longer in that position. It's no longer turgid. And, right, the pressure in the cell falls, and then the cells become flaccid, right? So that's the opposite when there's too much water being lost, being removed from the cell. And so that mechanical strength, that turgidity was providing the plant, that's lost. And so the plant will droop, right? Instead of being upright, right? Instead of being like this, you will see it sort of limping to the side, any one side or somewhere, right? And that's because of water loss. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, right, what are the importance of transpiration? Right, they mentioned the cooling effect, which I've already mentioned to you. And, right, they mention perhaps it is so that mineral ions are, because mineral ions from the soil are transported in the xylem as well, along with the water. And so you need transpiration to happen to keep the water moving up towards the leaves, where it will provide mineral ions, right? But because they are very dilute, that doesn't really make sense. Much more water is lost. And then they say, well, it is just something that happens in the process of photosynthesis. It's not something, right? You're going to have the stomata open to allow carbon dioxide to diffuse into the leaf, and as a consequence you cannot stop water from diffusing out. So that's just something that happens, right? So that's pretty simple and straightforward. Then is like, do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. Then comes the role of the stomata, right? So we know that they open and close, and there are a number of reasons or factors that influence that. So the opening and closing, right, can be triggered by factors such as light intensity, and then you have carbon dioxide concentration and humidity. So these are just examples, right? So and you then you can also have temperature, obviously, right? Because if there's too much water being lost, the stomata will close to try and stop it. So right, and these factors are not acting alone. These factors are not acting alone, right? So all of these factors act in, if I'm using the word correctly, in tandem. Let me just check if I'm using that word correctly. Oh, come on. Yeah. Okay. So these factors work in tandem, right? Meaning together. So the plant sort of processes what the overall situation is and then decides whether to keep the stomata open or closed. So if you have increase in light intensity, which would sort of be like, the day, and so the stomata would open. It would also open if there is low carbon dioxide concentration in the leaf, right? Because you want more carbon dioxide coming in for photosynthesis to occur, right? If water is being lost, then the stomata will close, as we mentioned a number of times already in today's class, right? And to prevent wilting from happening, right? So all of that affects whether the stomata remain open or closed, right? Too much water loss is called water stress. Something to note. So if there's a condition of water stress for the plant, the stomata will close. Clear? Yes, no, maybe? Hmm. Okay, then finally, I believe for today is translocation. Right, by definition, translocation is the movement of sucrose and amino acids in the phloem. So the xylem is mostly water, so it's very dilute, whereas the sap in the phloem can contain up to 25% of dissolved solids. And we know that translocation occurs in the, well, we already mentioned it's in the phloem. So the phloem sap, which basically means the liquid in the phloem, can contain up to 25% dissolved solids. Right, most of which are sucrose and amino acids, right? Perhaps some other substances. So another thing is that in the xylem, water moves in only in one direction, right? And that one direction is up, right? From the roots up the stem to the leaves. In the phloem, right, the contents move up or down depending on where they need to go, right? So it's not unidirectional. So the solutes move up or down. Now there are two terminologies that are linked that you need to know over here, and that is source and sink, right? So in this case, right, the area where the carbohydrate is synthesized, that's the leaf where photosynthesis is taking place. So carbohydrate synthesized in leaf, and so that is called the source. It is converted to sucrose and translocated in the phloem to areas where they need it. For example, right, uh, growing buds, fruits, flowers, roots, storage organs. Growing buds, fruits, flowers, roots, storage organs. Right, and so these areas where the sucrose is being transported, those are known as the sink. And that is simply because not all the parts of the plant can photosynthesize. So it majorly occurs in the leaves, and so it's translocated everywhere else. And so, right, finally, they mentioned that there are insects that feed on the phloem sap because it contains sucrose and amino acids, so that's a source of nutrition for them. And so they have mouth parts like needles that can pierce through and get directly to the phloem to get that nutritious phloem sap. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. Right, so I'll stop here. We can then start off with chapter 8, which is nutrition in humans, starting from tomorrow. And that is what the chapter is titled. Yeah, human nutrition. Yeah. Right, so yeah, that's all for today.